The gate has fallen. You don't see it, you hear it. A crack of wood and iron so violent it seems to shake the stone under your feet. Then shouting, running. The bell in the tower starts ringing, fast and uneven, not in triumph, but in panic. Everyone in the chamber goes still. For weeks, the castle has held. The men on the walls said it would hold. The Lord promised help would come. The chaplain spoke of endurance, of faith, of duty. Now armed men are inside, and if you are a woman in a captured castle, you know something the songs never mention. The battle is not always the end. Sometimes it is the beginning. Today I want to take you into one of the darkest realities of medieval war. What happened to women after a castle was taken. Not the romantic version, not the version softened by legend. The real possibilities that followed conquest, captivity, ransom, displacement, forced marriage, family separation, and the brutal uncertainty of surviving defeat. Because in medieval warfare, women were often not just caught in war. They were part of what victory decided. When people imagine a castle under siege, they picture soldiers, archers on the walls, knights in armor, lords shouting orders from towers. But castles were not just military strongholds. They were homes. Inside them lived wives, daughters, mothers, servants, widows, children, nurses, cooks, washerwomen, and refugees from the surrounding land. In wartime, even more people might be brought behind the walls because the castle was the safest place for miles. So when a castle fell, the consequences reached far beyond the men who fought on the battlements. And for the women inside, what happened next depended on one brutal question. Who were they to the victors? A noble woman might be worth ransom. A widow might carry a claim to land. A servant might be driven out with nothing. A young heir's mother might become a political hostage. A daughter might become part of an alliance she never chose. This is what conquest really did. It sorted human lives by value. The first hours were usually chaos. Even if surrender had been discussed, even if terms had been promised, the moment a castle was stormed, order could vanish. Men who had fought and bled to get inside often believed they were owed something for victory. Storerooms were broken open, doors were forced, chests were smashed, corridors that had belonged to one household in the morning belonged to another by night. And in that confusion, women did what people do when the old rules collapse. They looked for protection. Some hid in chapels. Some locked themselves in side chambers. Some gathered children and elderly relatives. Some tried to stay close to clergy. Some tried to stay close to whoever still looked powerful enough to give an order. Because in the aftermath of a taken castle, survival often depended less on law than on whose authority still meant anything. That was the first horror, not knowing whether anyone was still in control. If you were a noblewoman, you were rarely ignored. That did not make you safe. It made you useful. A lord's wife, a count's daughter, a wealthy widow. These women had value because they were connected to land, titles, inheritance, and alliance. A victorious commander might not think of them first as people. He might think of them as leverage. Who would pay for their release? What estate came with their marriage? Could their captivity force a rival family to negotiate? Could their remarriage transfer power legally? So elite women often survived because they could still be used. That might mean guarded confinement instead of immediate violence. It might mean letters sent demanding ransom. It might mean being taken to another castle under watch. It might mean a quick marriage arranged to absorb property and bloodline into the victor's control. Chronicles sometimes describe this as honorable keeping. But honorable keeping was still captivity. A guarded room is still a prison if you cannot leave it. But most women in a fallen castle were not noble, and history usually cared far less about them. Servants, kitchen workers, washerwomen, wet nurses, older dependents, women who had fled nearby villages and taken shelter behind the walls. These women rarely appear in chronicles unless something extraordinary happened to them. Most of the time, they simply vanish from the written record. But that silence should not be mistaken for safety. It usually meant the record was written by people who did not think their fates were worth preserving. And that makes them, in many ways, the truest victims of conquest. A noblewoman might at least be counted. A servant could disappear without a line. Some were driven out once the castle was secured. Some were absorbed into the labor of the new household. Some were displaced with children and the elderly. Some were separated from everyone they had arrived with. To survive the fall of a castle and still lose your home, your wages, your household, and your place in the world, that was one of the most common outcomes of all. One of the most likely fates after a castle fell was not ransom or ceremony. It was exile. You survive. You are not killed. The gate opens, and you are turned out. Maybe with a child, maybe with one bundle of clothes, maybe with nowhere to go. That kind of survival is easy to romanticize from a distance because it sounds better than death. But in the medieval world, losing your place could destroy you slowly. Safety depended on belonging to a household, a lord, a village, a convent, a kin network. Once that link was broken, survival became far more uncertain. Where do you go if your husband died on the walls? If your family's village was burned? If the roads are full of armed men and hungry refugees? If the next town shuts its gate because strangers mean risk? A castle's fall did not only create prisoners, it created women who were suddenly nobody's responsibility. And that could be just as dangerous. For elite women, one of the coldest consequences of conquest was marriage under pressure. To us, marriage sounds personal. In medieval politics, it was often territorial. A widow with claim to land might be pushed into remarriage. A daughter of the defeated line might be wed into the victor's family. A female heir might be placed under wardship until her future could be arranged for someone else's advantage. And here the violence becomes easy to hide. Not because it disappears, because it becomes legal. There may be witnesses, a priest, a contract, a seal, a ceremony. But beneath all of that is the same truth. A woman's future is being used to settle a conquest she did not choose. Take the castle. Take the title. Take the widow. Take the claim. That was how power could move after the shouting stopped. If you want to see what conquest really did, look at the children. A noble son might be taken as a hostage or ward. A daughter might be preserved for a future alliance. A younger child might remain with a mother only because separation served no purpose yet. And for poorer families, the damage was even more immediate. Confusion during the fall could break households apart in minutes. A father on the wall, a mother in the lower hall, a child hiding in a chapel, smoke in the corridor, strangers in armor in every room, then night, then silence, then people trying to count who is missing. For mothers, survival often meant one terrible goal above all others: keep the children together. That might mean hiding. It might mean begging. It might mean agreeing to terms they hated. It might mean walking into exile just to avoid separation inside an occupied castle. The chronicles rarely pause for these moments, but these moments were the real cost of defeat. If a woman of rank was taken captive, her imprisonment often looked far less dramatic than people imagine. Not chains, not darkness, not always a dungeon. More often it meant a room in another castle, a guarded household, a reduced number of servants, letters watched, visits restricted, movement controlled. You might still be addressed by your title. You might dine well enough. You might even be treated politely. And still, none of your choices are your own. You do not decide where you live. You do not decide when you leave. You do not decide whether your child is returned. You do not decide whether your ransom is worth paying. That is one of the coldest truths of medieval captivity. A prison can look respectable from the outside. After a castle fell, the victors took more than land. They took the narrative. Who resisted bravely? Who surrendered too late? Who deserved mercy? Who caused the ruin? Who was remembered at all? Women were often trapped inside stories written by men with political motives. A widow who negotiated surrender might later be called weak. A woman forced into remarriage might be described as ambitious. A mother who submitted to protect her children might vanish entirely from the record because survival is less dramatic than martyrdom. This is why the aftermath of conquest is so hard to recover honestly. Women were often reduced to functions in someone else's account. Widow, hostage, wife, heir, prize, claim. And yet behind each of those words was a human life being reorganized under pressure. Survival after a castle fell did not always look heroic. Often it looked quiet. It looked like staying close to the right people, speaking carefully, keeping children calm, remembering hidden food or silver that could buy time later, enduring humiliation because resistance would help no one, watching, waiting, adapting. For noblewomen, survival might mean preserving some legal claim through captivity. For servants, it might mean finding a new household before the road swallowed them. For widows, it might mean living long enough to keep children from being scattered. For mothers, it might mean accepting almost anything if it kept the family alive one more day. That is one of the hardest truths in medieval history. Courage was not always a last stand. Sometimes it was enduring a future you never chose. So what happened to women after a castle was taken? Some were ransomed, some were held under guard. Some were forced into marriages that transferred land and power. Some were driven into exile. Some lost children to politics, distance, or chaos. Some entered convents. Some vanished from the record so completely that history remembers only the men who conquered them. But if there is one pattern that runs through all of it, it is this. For women, the fall of a castle was often not a single moment of danger. It was the start of a long survival, a survival shaped by power, by status, by household, by motherhood, by luck, and by whether anyone in the aftermath still had reason to protect them. That is the part medieval legend rarely lingers on. Not the siege, not the breach, but the women who had to keep living after the walls failed.